Hello and welcome to the video version of Military History Inside Out, brought to you by WarScholar and located at warscholar.org. We talk about military history from ancient times to modern and everything in between. I'm Chris Alvarez, and thank you for watching. I'm speaking with Tim Brady, author of Three Ordinary Girls, the remarkable story of three Dutch teenagers who became spies, saboteurs, Nazi assassins, and World War II heroes. Published by Citadel, February 23rd, 2021. Thank you for speaking with me.
My pleasure.
So first, how did you get, I see you've written a number of World War II books. How did you get into studying and writing World War II in general, and then this specific book?
Well, I have specialized in writing history for a number of years now. I really got involved in it back in the 90s when I was working for a public television station in the Twin Cities.
Mm-hmm.
I was working in national productions, and I was assigned to work with on a project called Liberty, the American Revolution. It's a Ken Burns style series that was trying to did tell the history of the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
It appeared in 97 or 98, I can't recall. It won a Peabody Award. It was a great series to work on. And prior to that, I had studied creative writing and writing freelance articles. But I had been an undergraduate major in history, and working on this assignment kind of got me back involved in the study of history and applying it to my writing. And when I left that project, I started to focus on writing history as a freelancer.
Mm-hmm. So how did the idea for this particular book come from? Where did that arise from?
Well, it began with an obituary. My agent sent me the obituary for the youngest of the three women who were the primary subject of the book. Her name was Freddie Oversteven, and she died in 2018 in September at the age of 92, and her obituary appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And my agents loaded me to story possibilities, and the obituary was, to me, presented a great storyline that I'd never heard of. She was a teenager, and her sister were both teenagers at the start of the war, and they had gotten involved in the Dutch resistance when they were teenagers, and then the obituary had also said that they'd actually performed assassinations against Nazis and Dutch collaborators, which piqued my interest too, because I knew enough about resistance movements to know that that was a very unusual circumstance, both as teenagers and as girls.
Mm-hmm.
I read a little further. I found out that they were hooked up with a well-known Dutch resistance figure, Annie Schaap, who was the third of the trio of girls. And it just it blossomed into a book from there. Took it to the publisher, and the publisher bought a proposal, and we just started working on it.
So one of the things that struck me reading about the book, so, simple acts of spying, I could see teenagers doing that, but when you get to the point where they're actually blowing up things and assassinating grown men, officers, that's what really caught me. So tell me a little more about how do you break up the book? Is it like their story before the war, or is it all about their exploits during the war?
It begins before the war, but the the occupation of the Netherlands began in May 1940, as just in the great German push into Western Europe.
Mhm.
So it's a lot of the war. It's mainly the war and the epilogue too, because there's a very interesting post-war experience to their story.
Mhm.
But I too was interested in, when I heard about the details of what they did. It struck me at first as unlikely, to be honest. As someone who's looked at stories of various types coming from the war, and some of them are exaggerated, or they offer more and they tend to offer a lot more sometimes than they deliver. And this one, I discovered something as I researched, it really offered the goods, and by that I mean these these exploits that you outlined were fact. They happened, and it was remarkable that these young women were doing those things.
Mhm.
It just struck me as sort of gold when I was researching.
Mhm. So, I don't want you to give any spoilers, so to speak, any interesting things that you want readers to discover in the book. But can you talk about? I'm curious how alone were these three girls, or did they have how much support did they have from other resistance?
Well, they were part of a cell that operated in Haarlem, and Haarlem is a city just to the west of Amsterdam. It's about 20 minutes, 20 miles west of Amsterdam towards the North Sea. And they were recruited by a cell leader, a resistance leader, who had little more experience. And I mean, the fact of the matter is, there were few people in the Netherlands at the time who had how would they experience in a resistance movement. So there were obviously elements of amateurism in how they performed and what they did. And they started to organize as a small unit, and probably, though the dates are sometimes imprecise, but sometime in the winter of 1941 and 42, they started to gather as a very small cell in Haarlem, probably 6 or 7 people in total who were part of it. And the unit in Haarlem they were a part of was an extension of the Communist Party. It was an offshoot of though they never really fully aligned with the Communist Party. They were leftists in various stripes, and they were ideological compadres, and they organized to do. They didn't know exactly what they were going to do, because one of the biggest problems at the outset was that they had no weaponry. When the Germans came in, one of the first things they did was collected all of any possible weapons in society that didn't have a lot of weapons to begin with. And so their resources were very limited. And one of the things that they did when they set out as a resistance group was to collect weapons, and the primary source of weapons were the Germans and the occupying force, all armed and carried their weaponry on them. And so it was an interesting set of circumstances. The girls were set out to seduce in the first instance of an assassination. Girls were set out to seduce a Nazi or a German soldier who who was known to chase after Dutch girls in taverns in Harlem. They seduced them back to their hideout in Harlem, and one of the men in the group then proceeded to take the only pistol that they had, which was described by uh, one of the sisters as from the Stone Ages. The story was that it had actually belonged to some Dutch soldier who had served in what is now Indonesia, who hid it from the Germans by burying it in his backyard. So it was lucky it didn't misfire or backfire, but they actually assassinated this German soldier and took his uniform and took his weapon, and that that later in the war they started to get the weapons from Allied sources and people who were able to get weaponry into the Netherlands.
I'm speaking with Tim Brady, author of 3 Ordinary Girls. You can find more information about his work on his Amazon author page. If you like this episode of Military History Inside Out so far, please subscribe and hit the like button. Please check out my YouTube channel, WarScholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. If you're looking for fiction, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Now back to the video. Okay. So at the time, was school still conducted, or during the course of the occupation were they all home?
These were working class girls. The sisters were working class girls. They had really little formal education. From a very early age. Their mother was an ardent communist, and their principal their lifestyle was built around the party. They prior to the war, they were already enlisted by the mother into passing out the flyers and newsletters and local communist papers and that sort of thing. So they also were part of what was called the Red Aid, which was an association founded by the Communist Party, which provided shelter for refugees from Nazi Germany. So they were taking into their homes in the mid-30s. They were taking Jews and Nazi refugees from Germany. So they were again ideologically they were serious and deep anti-fascists and anti-Nazis.
So it sounds like then the mother, at least, would have been involved as well in some of these activities.
Well, she was and she wasn't. She was the girls were recruited by the head of the local cell, specifically for their age, because of their age, and because of their age, they were thought to be more. They could move around with more freedom than adults, and they could go smile at German soldiers as they were peddling their pikes around Harlem and not raise suspicions about what they were doing. So it was the teenage girls that he wanted more than the mother. The mother was doing her own thing within she continued to put out these flyers, and she had her own sort of printing materials. So she was doing her own thing, but she wasn't part of the violent activities that girls would become part of.
So even distributing the materials, though, the mother was probably doing something that was illegal per the
Oh,
Nazis.
it was not only illegal; it was extremely dangerous. Anything that was, they were taking risks in any activities they did, and they only grew through the course of the war. You know, some of the most dangerous work that they did was transporting some of the Jewish refugees from one safe house to the next. You know, if you were caught on the street with a Jew, you would be you would be going to a concentration
Hmm.
right along with the Jews themselves.
Mm-hmm. So what about the Germans? They must have been on edge. I mean, at some point they must have been acutely aware of some danger out there. Did you find that?
They became aware of it, and they also the measures that the Germans took, and whenever there was one of these assassinations, or they were the Dutch called them liquidaties, liquidations.
Mm.
They were they would the repercussions were harsh and extreme, and you know they would especially later in the war they would take uh, a group of usual suspects, to use the phrase from Casablanca,
Mm.
and haul them out in front of parliamenters or people wherever they would opted to perform these executions, and they would shoot at half a dozen, 10 or 12 suspected people,
Mm-hmm.
and then go out and bury them in the dunes towards the North Sea.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine that these girls probably lost a fair number of friends, either innocent people or people who were involved in activities.
They did, and without giving anything away, we haven't talked much about the third member, Hani Shah. Actually probably just gave something away, but because Hani did not survive the war.
Mm-hmm.
So they lost the closest. They lost numerous very close.
Mm-hmm. There's so many questions I could ask, but I feel like each one would just kind of give something else away in the book. Can you talk about any themes or any aspects of the book that you'd like to highlight that doesn't give something away?
Oh, that's a tough question. Um, I would say that it's it's a theme that has always moved me, and I think first steered me toward writing about World War II. And it has a personal relationship. My father was a veteran, and he went off to the South Pacific when he was 22 years old, and served on a LCI, which is it was a landing ship. It became a rocket ship. But he was a college student, and so he went through that program at the University of Wisconsin. Came out and was given command of this LCI and I always was struck with this notion of a farm kid from Wisconsin commanding a ship in the South Pacific at 22, the age of 22, and it always and so I was, by the time I reached that age, I was just dumbfounded, thinking, man, that's something that I can do. But the theme was uh, the youth of war, the expediency of of war demands that you throw young people into circumstances that you would think are so far beyond them that it's astounding to think that they would be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
When I heard about these teenage girls and their friend Hani Shah that doing the sorts of things that they were doing, once again, the girls would explain later in life that they were able to do this because they viewed themselves as soldiers. You know, they were brutal things. They did brutal things, and you know, you wonder about the psychological impact and
Mm-hmm.
just the fearfulness that they endured, and you know, just the terror that they would have endured. And you ask yourself, how could they do it?
Mm-hmm.
They, you know, like, you know, a soldier does what a soldier has to do, and that's how they viewed themselves. When I understood that, I think I began to understand them a little better and how they could survive, because they really were committed to what they were doing, and they did it because they felt they had to do it to liberate their country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. ROTC, I think. Were you thinking of ROTC before?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I don't know. I didn't.
Put that back in.
Yeah. So I imagine when after D-Day, I guess what they were doing, and again, we don't have to go into details, but I imagine their activities sort of might have shifted in a way once D-Day was underway.
Curiously enough, they got more severe, and it was a quirk of the circumstances of the Allied forces and the circumstances of what happened to the Netherlands after D-Day, meaning that as you know, looking at World War II history, the one major attempt to liberate Netherlands during the war, which was the Pocket Guard
Mm-hmm.
effort, and culminated in the famous battle at Arnhem, the bridge too far,
Mm-hmm.
and was a failure. So the Allies bypassed the Netherlands during the war, which left the Netherlands, particularly the area of the Netherlands that the girls were in, which was North Holland.
Mm-hmm.
They were sort of left high and dry by the circumstances, and the Germans continued their occupation through from D-Day forward, and if anything, it became more severe because the Germans started to pick Holland, the Netherlands dry of any commerce, any food, any clothing, anything that they could use in Germany to use for their own population, for soldiers on the Eastern Front.
Mm-hmm.
So the worst winter of the war for the people of the Netherlands was winter 44, 45.
Mm-hmm.
All of this prompted the resistance activities to pick up even more. It was twofold by the end of the war. There was the continued urge to get these people out of the Netherlands, and also by this time there was a deep hatred and animosity both against the occupiers and anyone who assisted the occupiers. So there was really a spate of liquidities against the collaborators
Mm-hmm.
assisting.
Yeah, I think I recall reading, I think in the Eastern Front, I think the Germans were also doing that, just taking as much material from the civilian population as they could to use, for their soldiers and their citizens back in Germany, just full scale
Oh
raiding
yeah,
of Europe.
that was you alluded to the explosives that the girls employed in the cause of the resistance. They were trying, the one big assignment that they had was to knock out a train that was transporting the contents of a factory in North Holland from North Holland to Germany.
Hmm.
I didn't know what they were making specifically. They loaded up a train and were going on a bridge over the river in Harlem, and girls were assigned to go out on the trestle style bridge and blow it up. They weren't successful, but in that case, they did another railroad bombing.
Hmm.
It was more successful a few months later.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me turn to the research you did for this book. What did you use to gather your information?
I used a couple secondary sources that were central to the writing of the book. One was a memoir by Truce over Stephen, and the second was a biography of Hani Shah by a journalist named Tom Kors. Both, I had, one of the difficulties of doing the story was all of my principal characters were along paths. By the time I started to research the book, memoir offered me an opportunity to get a sense of voice and character of Truce, and the biography was collected in the 70s and included interviews with people who were contemporaries of the girls during the war, all of whom were deceased. Yeah, I say all, but I can't say that with absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
I think most are wrong. I confirm those with the contemporary accounts. I would these stories were shared by the sisters well into the 21st century. They became subject of many interviews and documentaries in 2000s. And I would go to the documentaries and go to the interviews, confirm the stories from their more recent accounts of them. They were, the documentaries were themselves an interesting form of research for me because I don't speak Dutch, but by the time I was getting around to looking at these documentaries, I grasped bits and pieces of Dutch phrasing, and I knew the stories to begin with. So I would watch these documentaries, only a couple of which were transcribed into English, but I would watch them as they related the stories from that I read elsewhere. It was very interesting to just watch the documentaries, get the tenor of their voice, their gestures, the way they told, corresponded with each other as they were talking about these incidents. One was a German documentary where they were telling a story as the story was being reenacted in the context of the documentary. It was very interesting to hear them. It was a story that I knew early on in research. And it was very interesting to hear them tell this pretty colorful tale. It was actually the story of how they first met the man who had recruited them for the cell in Ireland. It was just an interesting, illuminating way to do research.
Mhm.
Someone.
So were you able to, did you visit the Netherlands, or were you able
Yeah,
to?
I spent 3 weeks over there. The Netherlands have there's a national museum of sort of a museum of war and remembrance and Holocaust remembrance. And that offered a lot of materials. And there's also a museum called the Verzet, which is resistance, definitely for resistance. And so it's dedicated solely to resistance in
Mhm.
the Netherlands.
And did they have much information on these girls?
Yeah, they were the girls are pretty well known figures as Hani Shah in particular is she's been the subject of oh she extending way back into the mid 60s or 50s. She was the subject of a quite a famous novel published in the Netherlands called Girl with the Red Hair. Hani had flaming red hair, and she was known to and by the Nazis as the girl with red hair, and so her story was quite well known. She was also this subject of this biography that I mentioned.
Mhm.
Plus, she was the subject of an early '80s movie that was big.
Mhm. Okay. I'm speaking with Tim Brady, author of Three Ordinary Girls. You can find more information about his work on his Amazon author page. If you like this episode of Military History Inside Out so far, please subscribe and hit the like button. Please check out my YouTube channel, WarScholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. If you're looking for fiction, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Now back to the video. What part of this research did you enjoy the most?
Going to the Netherlands, just getting a real feel. It was again, you do these things, and it isn't until you go there and see the territory that you imagine, you get a deeper sense of what their circumstances were. Haarlem is an old city. It's a medieval city, and I don't know if you've ever been to the Netherlands, but it's tightly packed, row housing, cobblestone streets, and of course the canals are omnipresent, and bicycles everywhere. They spent much of the story, much of the war, pedaling around on their bicycles. And bicycles are ubiquitous in the Netherlands. So you get a real sense of their circumstances and their surroundings. And it was just a wonderful experience being there, just walking around, getting a feel for.
I can imagine when they're doing their work that I can imagine, chivalrous young Dutch men, trying to either, offer their help to them, or maybe saying, no, don't do this. This is man's work. We'll take care of this. Was there anything like that?
Yeah, and that was I will say this with a little asterisk, because especially with the Oversteegen sisters, Truce in particular. She was sort of a, she comes off as sort of a modern figure, someone who would refute that sort of help. But they all, that was part of their role. Their role was to be the looking for help, but using their in, that sort of in that they might have had with German soldiers or Dutch police officers to make their way around the city and do what they wanted to do and cause resistance.
So so you say teenagers, but how old were they in, say, 41?
At the start of the war, the younger of the sisters would have been 14, older 16. Hani Shah would have been 20.
20. Okay. Okay.
You can do the math, and they figure out that the youngest of the sisters were still in their teen years at the end of the war. So they were kids. They were genuine kids.
Oh yeah. Yeah. What and again, I don't want any spoilers here, but what did you find that most surprised you in your research?
Well, just you, this is going to sound small, but it was the bicycle work that they did. They again, it's hard to give us a sense of how important bicycle culture was to their work. They actually would pedal around together, riding to a bicycle, and do their shooting in the back of a bicycle, just like Plains Indians, American Plains Indians on ponies. And they would practice shooting as they were riding their bicycles. It struck me as quite remarkable to think of teenage Dutch assassins riding their bicycles around and shooting at German officers and Dutch policemen. It was really quite remarkable to me to imagine those scenes and circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, in a sense, you can't imagine anything less harmful than seeing a teenage girl riding in a bicycle and
you can picture
in the Netherlands
flying and the little anklet socks and suddenly pulling out a pistol from an overcoat, purchased, by the way, expressly because the pistol would fit neatly and not be shown in a large overcoat. They would be right. So there was deviousness in what they were doing too. So
mm-hmm.
they were practiced by the end of the war.
Oh yeah, I imagine so. What question was most difficult? And again, no spoilers, but was there a question that was particularly difficult to research that you really had hoped to get an answer for and did, or maybe you still wish you understood?
Well, you always want to know more about the inner workings of the people you're writing. What did they think about what they were doing? And again, the fact that they were deceased by the time I started my story, that it was impossible to know more those matters without interviewing. If you looked at virtually everything you could find with what they said or how they had expressed their story, you did find exactly what you were looking. Every time I do a narrative history, I find this limitation for someone who began his writing career as a fiction writer, and was not limited by not knowing what character thought, because you're making it up yourself. It's hard that when you're writing a story to know that your limitation is what you can confirm by what they've said or written. So that's always a difficult narrative history.
So I'm sure this research, normally I ask, what emotionally moved you in your research? And it seems like there's a lot that could have. And again, without getting anything away, is there any particular event or situation that really struck you emotionally, either good or bad?
There are some incidents that you're going to have to pick up the book and read it because I think they'll move you in the same way that they move me.
Hmm.
They are incidents of cruelty to children and cruelty to Jewish refugees, and just general brutality and Nazi brutality that are color the book and color the existence of these girls through the war, and what they witnessed and what they deal with. They were moved by. I think I can say this safely. They were deeply moved by what they witnessed, and how they responded to it. Is, I think, more explainable when you see what they witnessed, give a description of what they witnessed, and their response, and as I suggested, the sometimes brutal nature of their response might be hard to explain. Again, when you're talking about young girls doing these things, unless and until you see what they witnessed as being members of the Dutch community and members of the human community.
Mm-hmm.
There were some brutal things.
Did you feel that how much were they motivated by their ideology versus the horrors that they saw? And did seeing the horrors elevate their activities even more than when it started?
I think the latter. I think that their motivation at the outset was at least it was whatever ideological motivation was immediately exacerbated by what they were witnessing from the German occupation and the Nazi regime. So it's sort of indistinguishable, even from the get-go, and it only escalated as they progressed.
Mm-hmm.
It became deeper and more systemic in their responses were more brutal.
Yeah, and I guess the question I wonder about is, let's say the Germans had not been brutal, if their occupation had been, gentle and kind, and I know it'd be hard to imagine, you know, that sort of occupation, but had the occupation been gentle, would they have been able to would resistance fighters like these girls have done less maybe, or might they have been less motivated to fight?
I'm afraid that's impossible for me to say. I would, if you're asking how committed they were to a communist ideology, I would say they were committed, but they I, they were teenagers too. it was not that it was not that they had a lifetime's experience of bitterness towards any circumstance that they were reared as dedicated to a cause, and so you can maybe extrapolate from that
Mm-hmm.
response.
Okay. So apart from sort of filling the historical gap, what do you hope this book will do for readers?
I that my book was intended from the outset for an American audience. I think that maybe Dutch readers will find some interest in it, find some new material in it. But I think that I wanted to fill in a gap for American history readers about the Dutch resistance and what it's like. The standard tale of the Netherlands during the war is sort of a combination of Anne Frank and Corrie ten Boom, and it's one side of the Dutch war experience story, but this is another side, and one that is it's fairly well known in the Netherlands. It is well known in the Netherlands, but I don't think is known in this country at all or as much as the story of the French resistance or other resistance stories in Western Europe. So I wanted to illuminate that aspect of resistance history for this audience.
Mm-hmm. So did you have any difficulties getting the book finished? And it sounds like publication wise, it seemed like it was pretty much good to go.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I I had a publisher from early on. I wrote a substantial proposal, and they bought the proposal, and publication stemmed.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have the only problem the finishing it was that you always have time constraints.
Was what? I'm sorry.
You always have time constraints and
Mm.
the pressure to finishing off to meet a publishing schedule is always high.
Okay. Did the fact that you had these previous works published on World War II, it sounds like that made it easier to get this proposal accepted, or is
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
I've done 4 prior books that had World War II subject matter, and so I had that history.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What's your current writing project? Do you have one?
My current writing project is non-existent. I'm always kind of searching around for subjects, and but there's nothing that I care to speak of right now, simply because I haven't gone into depth on any subject yet. So.
Mhm. But would it be, can you say if it would be World War II as well, or could it be anything?
I'd like to think it could be anything, but because I've written now on World War II, you tend to get a little bit pigeonholed in when you come up with book ideas, and if I say to my agent, I think I'd like to do something in a different phase of American history, for instance, or European history. He would say, well, that's going to make it a little more difficult unless it's a terrific idea that anyone is going to grab. So you get as a freelancer, this is my income, so I always have to be aware of the market of what I'm doing. don't have any, don't have a teaching income. I don't have any other source of income beyond my writing. So I have to be where I can sell it.
Okay. Do you have a website or social media where people can follow you?
You know, you can find a list of my books on Amazon. I got an author page on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
The publisher has a page for the book, and my other publishers, Random House has a page for a couple of my books. And, the first book I did was called 12 Desperate Miles, and it's a story of a ship that was involved with the invasion of North Africa in early stages of the war, November '42. The other book from Random House is a biography of Ted Roosevelt Jr., the son of Theodore.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, a famous general during World
War II. Yeah, and it's when you Google your name, of course, Google insists on putting Tom Brady at the top.
Yeah, I know. Who is that guy? I've had to deal with him now for years. I don't know why he takes precedent over me in the Google verse.
But definitely, yeah, your books are popular on Amazon. You know, it shows your ranking is good. But Tim Brady for listeners, Tim Brady, Tim, not Tom.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's how you can remember it, Tim Brady. All right. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
Oh, I think we've covered a lot of territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Yeah, and like I say, it ranks very well on Amazon. So I'd encourage everyone to pick this up and read about, like you say, a piece of World War II history. I think a lot of people, U.S. readers, are definitely not aware of in general. Yeah, so thanks for speaking with me.
My pleasure, Chris. Thanks for thinking of me.
Yeah, thank you. In the next episode, I speak with Robert Fuller about the U.S. Army in France after D-Day. Bullseye the subscribe button to catch that episode. Thank you for watching this video version of Military History Inside Out. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, WarScholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, WarScholar.org or MilitaryHistoryPodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. If you're looking for fiction, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Thank you for watching.